She was on her knees before she understood why. The lamplight shook in her hand, or perhaps her hand shook inside the lamplight. It was impossible to say which. And the stone floor pressed cold through the thin wool of her nightgown. Cold in that particular way that old stone holds cold, as though it has been saving it for exactly this moment. Clara Moorfield was 31 years old, and she had lived in this house her entire life. And she had never once, in all those years, opened the cedar box that sat on the lowest shelf of the larder, behind the salt pork and the winter preserves, and the smell of cloves that Nora always kept burning on a hook by the door. She had never opened it because she had never thought to. That was the honest truth. It was simply there, the way certain things in old houses are simply there, integrated so completely into the texture of daily life that they become invisible, the way wallpaper becomes invisible, the way a scar becomes invisible after long enough. The box was open now. Inside it, folded in thirds, was a letter. The paper had yellowed at the edges, softened with years into something that felt almost like cloth. And the handwriting on the outside, the handwriting that faced up at her as she knelt there with the lamp trembling, was not handwriting she recognized. Small and careful and slanted, every letter formed with an attention that suggested someone who had not always known how to write and therefore never took the act lightly. On the outside of the fold, 3 words: "To my daughter." Behind her, in the doorway, a man she had never seen before in her life stood without speaking. He was perhaps 40, lean in the way that suggested he had been lean his whole life rather than recently, with hands that were scarred across the knuckles and a face that was watchful in the way of someone who had learned to be watchful early and young. He had knocked on the kitchen door 40 minutes ago. He had said 4 sentences. He had not moved from the doorway since she'd walked to the larder. She turned the folded letter over in her fingers. She did not open it yet. She was not ready to open it yet. She knew, Clara said. Her voice was lower than she expected, stripped of everything unnecessary, the way voices get in the hours before dawn. She knew what he was going to do. The man in the doorway said nothing, but he didn't look surprised. And that absence of surprise was the thing that finally made Clara Moorfield understand that her entire life had been built on a story that someone else had written for her, and that the real story, the true one, had been here all along, folded in thirds behind the salt pork, waiting for her to come to her knees and find it. To understand what happened in that larder on the night of October 14th, 8999, you have to go back. You have to go back almost 30 years, to a county courthouse in rural Virginia, where a man was building something, not a career, not a reputation, though he was building those too, but an architecture, a structure of appearances so carefully assembled that it would take 2 generations and a cedar box full of secrets to bring it down. Edmund Moorfield had arrived in Harlan County in the spring of 1865 with $40, a letter of introduction from a judge in Richmond who owed him a favor, and a quality that would serve him better than either the money or the letter. He understood, with an almost surgical precision, what people wanted to believe about themselves and about the men they chose to trust. In 1865, what the people of Harlan County wanted to believe was that the old order was not entirely dead, that the chaos of Reconstruction, the federal troops, the new laws, the unfamiliar faces in positions of authority, was a temporary disruption, a fever that would break, and that once it broke, things would return to something recognizable. They wanted a man who looked like the before. Edmund Moorfield looked like the before. He was tall and measured in his speech, and he wore his clothes with an effortlessness that suggested old money, even though there was no old money. And he read Latin, which meant nothing practical, but which meant everything socially in the particular world of Harlan County's church vestry and courthouse steps. By 1868, he was practicing law. By 1871, he had been appointed to the circuit as an associate justice, the youngest man to hold that position in the county's recorded history. The Harlan County Gazette ran a notice that described him as a man of uncommon rectitude in common times. Edmund cut it out and kept it folded in his breast pocket until the paper wore thin. He had also, by 1871, been married twice. The first marriage was the one that appeared in the records, Catherine Ann Whitfield, daughter of a tobacco merchant from Danville. Slight and fair-haired and dead of a fever before their third anniversary, leaving behind an infant daughter with a mark on her left wrist like a crescent moon and no name yet, because they had not agreed on a name. And Edmund chose Clara because it was the name of his own mother and because he thought a simple name would attract less attention. And attracting less attention was, by then, a consideration he applied to nearly everything. The second marriage was the one that did not appear in any record that Edmund Moorfield controlled. Her name was Iris Vane. Iris Vane had grown up free in Albemarle County, the daughter of a freed carpenter and a schoolteacher, and she had the particular quality of self-possession that comes from being both entirely certain of your own intelligence and entirely familiar with the cost of making that intelligence visible. She was 23 when she met Edmund Moorfield. He was 31. The meeting happened at the home of a white landowner outside Charlottesville for whom Iris's father had done work, at a supper that Edmund attended as legal counsel for the estate. Edmund would later say, to himself, in the privacy of his own reasoning, because these were not things a man said aloud in Harlan County in 1869, that he had not planned any of it. That was possibly true. What was certainly true was that by the following spring, Iris Vane had been persuaded to enter into a private ceremony, witnessed only by a Methodist minister who would die of typhoid the following winter, and that by the autumn she was pregnant. The boy was born in the summer of 1870. He was named Thomas. He was 4 years old when his mother disappeared. Nora had been with the Moorfield household since before Clara was born. She had come to the house in 1866 as a kitchen girl, 17 years old and recently arrived from Charlotte County with her mother's rosary and nothing else. And she had risen, over the next 3 decades, to the position of cook, housekeeper, and the kind of institutional memory that old houses accumulate like sediment. She knew where the extra linens were kept. She knew which floorboards announced themselves under pressure. She knew that the cedar box in the larder was not to be touched. Clara had asked her once, years ago, she could not have been more than 12. What was inside it? Nora had not looked up from the bread she was working. Old papers, she had said. Nothing for children. And Clara, who trusted Nora in the way that children trust people who are simply always present, had not asked again. What Clara did not know, what she would not know until that October night when she was 31 and kneeling on cold stone, was that Nora had put the box there herself. That Nora had been the one who found the letter. That Nora had made, in the autumn of 1874, a decision that she would spend the next 25 years hoping had been the right one, and never being entirely sure. The house in 1874 was a different house. Edmund was at the height of his authority. The circuit judgeship had been confirmed. The Gazette had run a second notice, and the kind of men who came to Sunday supper were the kind of men whose names appeared on county commission documents and church vestry rolls and the boards of the 2 banks that served the region. The house was well staffed and well maintained, and entirely silent about the things it knew. And what it knew, by the autumn of 1874, was that Iris Vane was dead. It had been ruled an accident, a fall, the inquest found, on the staircase of the rooming house where she had been living in a town called Mill Haven, 14 miles from Harlan. She had been 30 years old. The presiding official at the inquest was a justice of the peace who, Nora would later learn, had borrowed money from Edmund Moorfield 18 months prior and not yet repaid it. Thomas, age 4, had been sent to live with Iris's sister in Richmond. The letter had arrived at the Moorfield house 3 days after Iris was buried. It was addressed to no one, because Iris had not known how to address it. She had not known, at that point, that she would not survive to deliver it herself. She had sent it to the house, because the house was the only address she had that connected to Edmund. And what she needed was for someone, anyone, to find it and to keep it. Nora had opened it. She had read it twice. She had held it over the kitchen fire for a long time. Long enough that the edges had browned, and then she had not burned it. She had folded it back in thirds, and she had put it in the cedar box, and she had put the cedar box on the lowest shelf of the larder. And she had spent 25 years carrying that decision like a stone in the chest. If she gave it to Edmund, he would destroy it. If she gave it to Clara, the child was too young, and then too young, and then time had moved in the way time moves, when you are afraid of what it is moving toward. If she gave it to the law was Edmund. So she had kept it. And she had told herself, every year, that the right moment had not yet arrived. Before we go further, if this story's already moving something in you, take a moment and leave a like. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. There are stories like this one that need to be told, and it takes a community to keep telling them. Now, back to Harlan County and the autumn that changed everything. Edmund Moorfield retired from the circuit bench in 1893, citing his health, which was not in fact poor. His health would remain vigorous for another decade. What was poor by 1893 was his sense of security. It had begun with Thomas. Thomas Vane had grown up in Richmond in his aunt's house, carrying his mother's name and his mother's story and very little else. He had grown up understanding, in the specific way that children understand things they are never directly told, that his existence was inconvenient to someone powerful. His aunt had been careful and afraid in equal measure. And that combination, the care and the fear, had taught Thomas to be observant in a way that purely happy childhoods do not require. By the time he was 20, Thomas had his mother's story assembled as completely as a man could assemble a story from fragments. He knew about Edmund. He knew about the marriage. He did not know about the letter. By the time he was 30, he had found the minister's son. The minister who had performed the ceremony was dead, but the son was alive and living in Staunton, and the son had found, in his father's effects, a record of the ceremony written in his father's hand, with 2 names and a date. By the time he was 35, he had begun to write letters. He had not written to Edmund directly. He was not reckless. He had written carefully and obliquely to certain parties in Harlan County, an older attorney, a former clerk of the court, making inquiries, testing the grounds, seeing what remained above the surface and what had been buried. One of those letters had eventually, through a chain of hands, been shown to Edmund Moorfield. That was why Edmund had died. The death was a masterwork of logistics, in the way that only a former jurist who had spent 30 years watching men escape their circumstances could engineer. There was a funeral. There was a coffin. The death had been arranged through a sympathetic physician whose gratitude to Edmund ran deep and whose discretion ran deeper. The grave in the churchyard of St. Andrew's Episcopal contained, as far as Nora had been able to determine over the years that followed, nothing but weight. Clara had buried a box of sand and believed she had buried her father. She had believed it for 6 years. She had believed it on the October night in 1899, when a man knocked on the kitchen door at 1:30 in the morning and said, with the directness of someone who has rehearsed for a long time, "My name is Thomas Vane. My mother was Iris Vane. Edmund Moorfield was my father and yours. He is not dead. And he knows that I have come here." Clara had not screamed. She registered this about herself with a distant kind of attention, the way you notice the temperature of a room once you have been in it long enough to stop noticing the room itself. She had opened the door and looked at the man, and looked at the envelope in his hand. And then she had stood aside and let him in. He had sat at the kitchen table without being invited to, and she had put the kettle on without deciding to. They had looked at each other across the scrubbed pine surface in the particular way of two people who are strangers and are simultaneously not strangers at all. "How long have you known?" she said. "About my mother, my whole life." He set the envelope on the table between them. "About you, 3 years." "What's in the envelope?" "A record of their marriage, written in my grandfather's hand." He paused. He was a minister. He kept records of everything. It was his faith, I think, that made him trust that the records would eventually matter to someone. Clara looked at the envelope, but did not reach for it. "He's alive," she said. "He's in Harper's Mill, about 80 miles from here. He has been using the name Harold Crane. He has a house, a housekeeper, and, from what I have been able to determine, a reasonable expectation that no one will come looking." The kettle began to sound. "Why now?" she said. "Why not years ago?" Thomas looked at his hands on the table. The scars across his knuckles, she noticed, were old. Not the scars of recent violence, but of a life that had moved through hard surfaces. "Because I didn't know about the letter until 3 months ago," he said. "Nora wrote to me." Clara went very still. "Nora," she said. "She's been carrying it for 25 years. He met her eyes. "She said she would have burned it 100 times, but she could never make herself do it. She said she kept thinking someone would need it eventually." A pause. "I think she always knew it would be you." Nora was 72 years old, and she was asleep in her room above the kitchen, and Clara stood outside her door for a long time before she did not knock. There would be time for that conversation. There would be time for what it meant that the woman who had braided her hair and taught her the names of herbs and told her she was capable of anything had carried a secret for 25 years that Clara could have swallowed whole, had she only been given the chance to try. There would be time for anger, and there would be time past the anger. Not tonight. Tonight she followed Thomas to the larder. He did not go in. He stood in the doorway and pointed to the lowest shelf, and she went to the shelf and moved the salt pork and the winter preserves, and found the cedar box behind the smell of cloves. And she took it to the middle of the floor and knelt with the lamp and opened it. The letter was inside, folded in thirds, browned at the edges, the handwriting small and careful and slanted, as if the writer had not always known how to write, and therefore never took the act lightly. To my daughter. Her fingers were not entirely steady. She unfolded the letter. The handwriting inside was the same, careful, slanted, each letter formed with deliberate attention. The date at the top was September 3rd, 1874. Iris Vane had written this letter 7 weeks before she died. If you are reading this, then you are old enough to read it. And that is enough for me to know. I want you to know certain things, and I want you to know them not because knowing will make you happy. I do not think it will make you happy, but because you deserve to know what you come from, and what you are worth, and what was taken. Your father is Edmund Moorfield. He is also the father of my son Thomas, who is your brother, and who I pray is alive and well and old enough to help you if you need helping. I do not think Edmund is a man who can be reasoned with. I think he is a man who has lived so long inside his own constructed world that he has forgotten there is anything outside it. But you are outside it, and Thomas is outside it. I have a mark on my left wrist, a birthmark in the shape of a crescent moon. I want you to look at your wrist. If you have it too, then you know you are mine. You know you come from me as much as from him. You know that the part of you that he could not control, could not name, could not use, that part is from me. I am writing this because I do not know what he is going to do. I know only that he has decided something, and that whatever he has decided will be presented to the world as something else, and that by the time anyone asks questions, the questions will have been given answers. Keep this letter. Keep Thomas if you can find him. I love you. I have loved you since before you had a name. He chose the name. I would have chosen something different. But you are Clara, and Clara is who you are, and whoever you are is already more than he will ever understand. Iris, as she read it 3 times. The 3rd time she read it, her left hand was pressed flat against the cold stone floor, and the crescent moon birthmark on her wrist was flush against the rock, and she could feel the cold moving through it. And she thought about a woman sitting in a rooming house in Millhaven in September of 1874, writing a letter to a daughter she had never named. And she thought about 25 years of cedar and cloves and Nora standing in a kitchen with the paper over a fire and not burning it. And she thought about Thomas at the kitchen table with his scarred hands and his 3-year knowledge of her existence. And she thought about Edmund Moorfield in a house 80 miles away, under a borrowed name, sleeping or perhaps not sleeping, perhaps watching the road. She looked at Thomas in the doorway. She had the mark, Clara said. She describes it exactly. Thomas nodded. He had known. He had seen his mother's wrist in every memory he had of her, which were not many, because he had been 4 years old. But the ones he had were detailed in the way that early memories are detailed. Not full and continuous, but bright at the edges, the way photographs burn out in the light. What do we do? Clara said. The answer to that question would take 11 more days. If you've stayed with this story this far, you already know it's something different. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. The ending is coming, and it will stay with you. The attorney's name was Silas Greer. He was 64 years old and had practiced in Harlan County for 38 years, long enough to have overlapped substantially with Edmund Moorfield's tenure on the bench, and long enough to have developed what he would have described privately, to himself alone, as a suspicion. Clara came to his office on a Thursday morning. She brought the letter. She brought the minister's record. She brought a second document that Thomas had produced. A notarized statement from a woman in Richmond, one of Iris's neighbors at the rooming house, who had written down and sworn to in 1889 that she had seen Edmund Moorfield at the house in Millhaven on the night of October 28th, 1874, 2 days before Iris Vane was found at the bottom of the stairs. The woman's name was Della Parks. She had been afraid to come forward in 1874 because coming forward in 1874 in rural Virginia as a black woman against a white circuit judge was not coming forward. It was presenting yourself for ruin. She had written the statement in 1889 because by 1889 Edmund was retired. And still she had notarized it quietly and given it to Thomas quietly and asked him to use it carefully and at the right time. Silas Greer read all of it without speaking. When he finished, he took off his glasses and set them on the desk and rubbed the bridge of his nose with the practiced gesture of a man who has been reading difficult documents for a very long time. "You understand," he said, "that the complication here is not the evidence." "I know what the complication is," Clara said. "He held that bench for over 20 years. I know. The men who would hear any proceeding against him were appointed by him, or went to school with him, or owe him money." Clara folded her hands on the desk. "I know all of that." Greer looked at her for a moment. "Then what do you want from me?" "I want to know," Clara said, "what is possible, not what is easy. What is possible?" Greer picked his glasses back up. He looked at the letter again. He looked at Della Parks's notarized statement. He looked at the minister's record. "There is a federal circuit," he said slowly. "Reconstruction gave jurisdiction in certain matters. Iris Vane was a free woman of color," Clara said. "Murdered under the suppression of evidence. That is a federal matter." Greer looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "You've already worked this out," he said. "I've had 11 days, she said. "I didn't sleep much." They found Edmund in Harper's Mill on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Clara had knelt on the cold stone floor of the larder. She had not been there when they found him. She had wanted to be. She had decided she would not be, because the kind of witness she would have been would not have helped the case. She stayed in Harlan and she waited, and Thomas rode with the federal marshal. And what Thomas told her afterward, sitting at the same kitchen table where it had all begun, was this: Edmund Moorfield had answered the door himself. He had been wearing his house clothes, a wool vest, no jacket, and his hair was still white and thick at 71. And he was carrying a cup of coffee. He had seen Thomas on the step, and the cup had stayed level in his hand, and his face had not changed, not immediately. And then the marshal had stepped into the light, and the cup had gone very slightly sideways, and a small amount of coffee had spilled onto Edmund's wrist. He had looked at the spill for a moment. Then he had looked up at Thomas. "I wondered," Edmund Moorfield said, "which one of you would come first?" The federal proceeding took 14 months. Clara did not attend every session. She attended the ones that mattered, and she sat in the gallery, and she wore the same dark dress to each one, and she kept her left hand in her lap with the crescent moon birthmark turned up toward the light. It was a private gesture, not visible from the floor. She was doing it for herself and for Iris, who had described it in a letter written to a daughter she had never held. Edmund's attorneys were excellent. They were excellent in the way that only 30 years of accumulated favors can make a man's attorneys excellent. There were delays and motions and continuances, and a stretch of 4 months in which it seemed possible that the whole architecture of evidence would be dismantled piece by piece, and the pieces scattered. And then Della Parks came. She was 71 years old, and she had come from Richmond on the train alone. And she walked into the federal courthouse in her best dress, and she sat in the witness chair and she told, in a voice that was entirely steady, what she had seen on the night of October 28th, 1874, in the rooming house in Millhaven. She described Edmund Moorfield's face in the doorway. She described Iris's voice through the wall, not the words. She had not been able to hear the words, but the register of the voice. The particular quality of fear, inside anger that she had recognized because she had heard it before, in her own life, in other rooms. She described coming into the hallway the following morning and finding Iris at the bottom of the stairs. "And you believed it was an accident?" the examining counsel asked. Della Parks looked at him with an expression that contained 25 years of considered response. "I believed," she said, "that what was going to be called an accident had already been decided before it happened." Edmund Moorfield was convicted on a federal charge of fraud and obstruction relating to Iris Vane's inquest. The murder itself, the actual question of what had happened on the stairs in Millhaven, was never resolved to the law's satisfaction, because the law requires certainty, and certainty is the first casualty of careful men who have had 30 years to prepare. He was sentenced to 12 years. He served 4 before dying of a stroke in the federal penitentiary in the winter of 1904. Clara was informed by letter. She read the letter at the kitchen table with her morning coffee, and she held it for a while. And then she set it down and looked out the window at the November light on the yard, and thought about what she felt, and found that what she felt was not simple, and was not going to be simple, and that was all right. Some things earn their complexity. Thomas had come back to Harlan County. He had not come to live. He had built a life in Richmond, and it was a good life, the kind that had been assembled carefully and at cost, and that he was not about to leave. But he came at Christmas and at the end of summer, and he sat at the kitchen table in the house that had once been the house of the man who had erased his mother, and he drank Nora's coffee, and he talked with the half-sister who had knelt on cold stone in a larder while he stood in a doorway and waited to see what kind of person she was. She had turned out to be, he thought, the kind of person their mother had expected. Nora died in 1906, in her room above the kitchen, quietly, in the way that people die when they have been ready for a while. Clara had been with her. They had talked the night before, with the lights low, with the kind of honesty that Clara had sometimes found difficult, and that Nora had spent her life being both honest and afraid. And that was all right, too. 25 years is a long time to carry something alone. Clara had told her so. She meant it. In Nora's room, in a box under the bed, Clara found a journal. She did not read it immediately. She brought it downstairs and made a cup of coffee, and sat with it for a long time before she opened the cover. On the first page, in Nora's handwriting, larger and less careful than Iris's, the handwriting of someone who had learned late and written for function rather than beauty, was a single line. I kept it because she deserved to have someone keep it. Below that, in smaller letters, an edition that had been made at a different time, in different ink, as if written years after the first. I hope she knows I would have burned it 100 times if it would have made any of it not true. It didn't, so I kept it. In the spring of 1907, Clara Moorfield deeded the house to Thomas Vane, or rather, to his children, of whom there were 3 by then. A daughter named Iris, and 2 boys she had not yet met but intended to. She kept a portion of the land, enough for a small house of her own, and she kept the cedar box, and she kept her mother's letter, and she kept the crescent moon on her wrist, which had always been there and which she had never, until a cold October night in 1899, understood was anything other than a mark. It was, in fact, a question that her mother had left her, a question she had carried in her body for 31 years without knowing it was a question. It was, "You are mine. You come from me. Do you know what that means?" She knew now. It had taken a cedar box and a November night and a man standing in a doorway and Nora in 25 years and Della Park's steady voice in a federal courtroom. But she knew. She thought sometimes about the crescent moon, about how a mark that you have worn your whole life can mean nothing, and then mean everything. About how the body keeps what the mind is not ready to hold. About how inheritance is not only property and name, it is shape and mark, and the particular quality of a person's attention to the world, and the way they form their letters when they finally learn to write, and what they decide to keep when the fire is right in front of them. Edmund Moorfield is buried in the penitentiary yard in a plot without a headstone, because no one claimed him, and that is the end of him. Iris Vane is buried in Albemarle County, in a churchyard that kept her name correctly, and the stone was paid for by Thomas in 1901. When he finally had enough money, and when the finding of that particular churchyard was the work of a year of letters and county records and a county clerk in Charlottesville, and who took the question seriously. The stone says, Iris Vane, 1844 to 1874. She knew what she was worth. Thomas wrote that. Clara had approved it. She thought it was exactly right. If this story touched you in a way you're still trying to name, it's because it's real. Not this family, not these names, but this. The thing that gets buried. The thing that someone keeps at great cost because they cannot make themselves destroy it. The question you carry in your own body without knowing it is a question. Leave your like. It's a way of saying, I saw this. I honor the people who lived something like it. Share it with someone who needs to hear a story about what survives. And subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories like this one. Stories that were almost lost, that are waiting to be told. In the comments, I want to ask you something, and I mean it genuinely. What would you have done with the letter? If you were Nora, standing over that fire in 1874, would you have burned it? I want to read every answer.